Well, tonight we're going to be covering a lot of ground on historical UFO cases going all the way back to Roswell and some other early interesting cases like the Lonnie Zamora Socorro, New Mexico sighting and some other interesting developments on the UFO front. What have two former astronauts said about the subject? An interesting twist on the 1997 Phoenix Lights sightings, the alleged Admiral Wilson memo, and much more as longtime investigative reporter Randall Fitzgerald joins me on this 100th episode of Passion for the Paranormal. Well, greetings out there, fellow truth seekers, and welcome once again to Passion for the Paranormal, bringing a passion for the paranormal to you. I am your host, Curry Stegan, and guess what? We have reached a milestone in the show, and it's really exciting. Finally reached our 100th episode. Wasn't sure we'd ever get there, but here we are. And just want to offer a big thanks to you listeners out there who made this all possible. Would have never got here if it wasn't for you. So thank you so much for tuning into the show. Thank you for listening. One way you can say thank you is if you want to, on whatever podcast app you're listening to out there, to simply hit that subscribe button. If you're an Apple user, you can always offer that rating and review of the show. Give us some feedback on this 100th episode. If you have a family member, friend, coworker, someone you know that you think they'd like to tune into the show or check it out, let them know about it. Share that link with them and put it out there. You can also go out to the website at passion4theparanormal.com. There you can, if you got behind on episodes, you want to catch up on some, you can catch up on episodes there. Sign up for the free newsletter and also visit us at Facebook at facebook.com/passion4theparanormal. And really excited on this episode to have the caliber of investigative journalist I have joining me, and that is Randall Fitzgerald. He has been researching and delving into the UFO phenomena for better part of 50 years now. Wow, that is a long time. His new book, Alien in the Mirror, covers a lot of ground on the UFO phenomena. I can't think of anybody better to have joining me on this 100th episode than Randall. So it's going to be really great to talk with Randall. We're going to talk a lot about, the historical cases out there, going all the way back to Roswell, and a lot of the newer stuff too. He's got a lot of knowledge on this subject, so it's great to have Randall joining me. I think it's going to be a great discussion. I really hope you're going to enjoy tonight's episode. I really do think you are going to enjoy it. And once again, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for helping us get to number 100. And I'm really eager to get into this discussion here with Randall. And thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so joining me tonight is Randall Fitzgerald. And he has been an investigative journalist since 1974. His investigative articles have been featured in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Reader's Digest, where he spent 2 decades as a roving editor. Randall has also authored 10 books that have been translated into a dozen languages, and he founded and co-edited Second Look, a seminal magazine about the search for other life in the universe, the origins of civilization, and the nature of consciousness. He has appeared on ABC's The View and hundreds of other television and radio shows, including the very popular Coast to Coast AM. His latest book is Alien in the Mirror, Extraterrestrial Contact, Theories and Evidence. Randall, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Great to be with you.
And it's great to be with you, and quite a lot of ground you've covered in the new book. You know, it's kind of a, historical coverage of the whole subject. And I mean, it goes back quite a bit. A lot of people consider the modern age of ufology kind of starting with Roswell, but I think you even went back pre-Roswell. But a lot of stories covered, and a lot of information covered in the book. And I was quite impressed by that. But before we do that, you've been a journalist for a long time. You've been in the game for a long time. How did you get involved in this crazy UFO subject and researching and delving into cases?
1964, I was 13 years old, growing up in a small town in eastern Texas, and I became a member of NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. I was curious about everything that was unknown. I was a fan of the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits, those old TV shows. So I had a curiosity that set me off on a search. And NICAP, uh, for the subject of UFOs at that time, was the premier organization investigating sightings. So as a result of that, I had a childhood fascination that carried over into adulthood. And I always swore that at some point, if I had the opportunity, I would get more deeply involved in the subject. And that point came about 14 years later, in 1978. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. And I founded a magazine called Second Look. And my co editor was Robert K.G. Temple, who was the author of a book that was a bestseller called The Sirius Mystery, about the Dogon tribe in Mali and about astronomical information that they had, which seemed to be somehow linked to the Sirius star system. So Robert and I became co-editors of this magazine, Second Look, and we published for about 2 years. So we never got beyond 10,000 subscribers. And we were able to interview and attract as contributors a wide range of scientists as well as people in the ancient astronaut subject realm and people involved with the UFO subject, such as Jacques Vallée. And we had Eric von Daniken as a contributor. But we had a lot of scientists as well, and even science fiction authors like Isaac Asimov, who contributed an article to our very first issue. So that put me in the spotlight for a period of time, about 2 years in this subject area. And then I got off into other subjects and working for other publications. And so I've always been sort of in the background of this subject area.
Now, I know you've done some research into the Roswell case. And, a lot of people consider that kind of the seminal case that, kind of the case that, launched us into modern ufology, if you will. And, I know Stanton Friedman did a lot of work. He kind of, some people credit him as kind of breaking that case or kind of, getting information out about that case. How did you get involved? And I know you've had a little bit of dealings with Stanton Friedman. How did that kind of come together?
It came about because of a man named Leonard Stringfield, who was a public relations executive with a chemical company in Ohio and who lived not far from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And in the late 70s, Leonard Stringfield was sort of a magnet for military and ex-military people who had stories about crash saucers and about debris fields and cover-ups and so forth. And Stringfield collected these stories. And one of the individuals that he had contact with was a former intelligence officer in the Air Force, Major Jesse Marcel, who, of course, is the key person in connection with Roswell in 1947. And Leonard Stringfield had taken interviews in deep background for most of these people in connection with these stories. But Jesse Marcel had indicated an interest in going public. He wanted to be a whistleblower because he thought the story should be told. So Leonard Stringfield had pointed Stanton Friedman in the direction of Jesse Marcel and doing interviews with him. And this was all in mid 1979. And Stanton Friedman, who had wanted to write for the magazine that I was co-editor of, Second Look, got in touch with me. And I recount the story in the book, An Alien in the Mirror, how early one morning Stanton called me. I'm not sure where he got my number. It must have been from Leonard Stringfield. His first words to me were about Roswell was a cosmic Watergate, and the first journalist that broke the story would win a Pulitzer Prize. And that sort of caught my attention. And he proceeded to describe the parameters of what we now know as the Roswell case. And this was almost a year before the first book had been published on Roswell, the Charles Berlitz book. And so, as a result of this connection with Stanton Friedman and Leonard Stringfield, I interviewed Jesse Marcel. But I didn't do it for Second Look magazine. We didn't really have the resources for me to do any in-depth investigation of the subject of Roswell or crashed UFOs. So I had contacts at the Washington Post because I had written investigative features for that newspaper previously. So I contacted a couple of the editors I knew there, and they gave me the assignment. Again, this was the summer of '79, to look into the Roswell crash. But at the time, I wasn't aware that the focus needed to be just on Roswell. There were rumors of at least 5 different types of scenarios of rumors about crashed UFOs at that time, involving far western Texas and a number of different sites in New Mexico, not just Roswell. So at the expense of the Washington Post, I set off doing interviews, starting with Jesse Marcel, trying to track down the substance of the story. And I interviewed a fellow in Arizona with Ground Saucer Watch. That was one of the UFO groups at the time. And he was an aerospace engineer. And he had gotten signed affidavits from a half a dozen different military officers about a number of different crash sites. And so I was trying to sort through at that time all the different scenarios to figure out which one had the most credibility and which one, in the short period of time that I really had, which was a couple of months, where the evidence could be found that was persuasive enough where the article would be printed by the Washington Post. And eventually I sort of wrote an article that in general discussed all of these crash scenarios, including Roswell. I turned the article in along with some photographs of alleged crash sites that Leonard Stringfield had provided me. And then I waited, and months went by. And in 1980, of course, the first Roswell book was published with Charles Berlitz, his name on it. And then I contacted the Washington Post to try to find out what happened to my article. And I was given the runaround at the time. And they had basically killed the article without telling me, though they had paid me the full amount for publication of the article. So I asked for the photographs back. They said they couldn't find the photographs that Stringfield had provided. They couldn't find the FBI documents that Stringfield had provided me, etc. So it became a very curious case, as I recount in The Alien in the Mirror. It was my first introduction to Roswell, well before it was in the national consciousness. But it was curious because I could never figure out, and I could never get a straight answer from the editors at the Post as to why they killed the article.
Yeah, it certainly begs the question. There's been a lot of talk over the years about government involvement, co-opting media to kind of either ignore stories or, basically to downplay them or to discredit them. Have you gathered anything on that subject about possible government involvement in doing such a thing, co-opting media, trying to downplay stories, discredit them? Anything you came across in your research on that?
Well, of course, there's a litany of those examples throughout the book based on material provided by other authors. When I summarize their own books, everyone from Richard Dolan, who's done, of course, the UFOs in the National Security State series of books that recounts a lot of instances of that, and many other authors have as well. In my own case, in thinking back, probably the situation that came closest that I personally experienced involved the CIA and naval intelligence. And this was a case, again, that's recounted in the book, Alien in the Mirror. I started investigating when I was co-editor of Second Look. And this was in late 78, early 79. I'd heard about a woman named Frances Swan, who lived in a rural area of Maine, who during the 1950s had claimed that she had been channeling an extraterrestrial intelligence by the name of AFA, A-F-F-A. And she had been taken seriously because one of her neighbors was a former rear admiral, retired. And this rear admiral had alerted in Washington, D.C., naval intelligence about this woman and how she was channeling some sort of entity or energetic force or whatever it might be that he found was rather persuasive. So naval intelligence, beginning in about 1953, began to send teams of intelligence officers to visit with Frances Swan and sit with her. And she would go into a trance and channel this alleged extraterrestrial entity as they would ask her questions. And they ask her a lot of technical questions. For instance, what is the apogee of Uranus at a certain point in the summer sky, et cetera, et cetera. And she sometimes had accurate answers, accurate enough that they were impressed. So these teams kept coming back until eventually in about 1959, a team came and one of the naval intelligence officers asked if he could learn himself to channel this entity. So Frances Swan proceeded to give him instructions. He entered a trance and thought that he was in contact with Alpha. So he and this other intelligence officer went back to Washington, D.C., and they were alerting their superiors that they might have established a contact through a rather unusual source. And as a result, a meeting was set up at a obscure CIA office in downtown Washington, D.C. And the naval intelligence officer, along with a colleague, met up with some CIA officers, one of whom was Arthur Lundahl. Arthur Lundahl was head of the photographic division of the CIA. He analyzed photographs, for instance, a few years later during the Cuban Missile Crisis that helped bring about a resolution of that crisis. So Arthur Lundahl had these two guests, one of who claimed to be channeling this extraterrestrial intelligence. And they had a session in the Lundahl's office. And Lundahl, all of this was documented, by the way, in a memo, CIA memo, which I reproduce in the book. So this naval intelligence officer was asked to channel AFA. And during the course of the questions that were being asked, Lundahl asked, "Can you make a UFO appear?" And the officer said, through using AFA, "When?" And Lundahl said, "Right now." And the intelligence officer said, "Go to the window and look out." So three of the men, including Lundahl, stood up, went to the window, parted the curtains, and they claimed to have seen, and this CIA memo details it, a silvery object in the sky. And one of the other CIA officers, not Lundahl, immediately called to try to query the air traffic control for the Washington, D.C. area to find out if anything was showing up on radar. And the response was, "We're sorry, but for some unknown reason, that part of the sky that you're asking about is blacked out to us. on radar returns right now, which was obviously very odd. So what transpired from that point forward is a series of other meetings occurred, larger meetings that involved more naval intelligence officers, more CIA, and also involved Project Blue Book. And the head of Project Blue Book at that time, Colonel Bob Friend, was sent from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to attend one of these meetings. And so this memo continues to describe what transpired, and there was a bit of a split in this group between those who thought that this naval intelligence officer was delusional, and that anyone who believed him was a suspect for delusion. And another group who felt that there was something credible here that was ongoing and it should be investigated. So long story short, I began to investigate this years later in 1978, 79. I went to Maine. Frances Swan was still alive. I interviewed her, spent time with her, got access to all of her notes and her diaries documenting the names and the dates of which individuals from the government had come to see her. So, and I published a long article in the second book about this. But during the course of doing the research, I interviewed Lundahl, who was still with the CIA. He would soon to be retired. But he denied that any of this ever happened. And he continued for years to deny that any of this had happened when he was asked to comment publicly. But privately, it was another matter. I since learned from Jacques Vallée, who had conversations with Lundahl, that Lundahl had confessed to Jacques that, in fact, everything in the CIA memo reproduced in the book was true, and that they had seen something that they couldn't explain, and that the radar quadrant had been blacked out for some reason, etc. So the upshot of this was, in terms of my personal experience, connected to your question, is that I saw evidence of an ongoing cover-up of this particular case. And strangely, a week after I had interviewed Frances Swan in Maine, I got a call from her again saying she had received a phone call from a naval intelligence officer, retired, living in Florida, who somehow had heard that I had appeared in Maine to interview her, and he was calling her to find out questions I had asked, and so forth. So obviously, the reporter in me wanted to know who this person was, and she gave me his name, and she gave me his phone number in Florida, and I called him. His Lieutenant Commander Hudson was his name, and he refused to talk to me. And I asked why. I said, this is an old case. It goes back more than 2 decades. Why are you not willing to even discuss this, even just on deep background? And his answer was curious. He said, because it's still a matter of national security. And I, of course, tried to question him, well, in what way is it national security? And this was a housewife in Maine who was channeling an entity that most of you apparently didn't believe was real. Why did you keep coming back? What was it about her and about this particular case that is still a matter of national security? And I never got a clear-cut answer. All I got was just a runaround about people's involvement and who was really involved and so forth.
I wanted to talk a little bit about, so you were doing investigative journalism into the subject of Roswell. We're talking about the late 70s here. It was certainly a different time than it is now. Talk about the atmosphere. I mean, you already mentioned the fact that the story was squashed. What was kind of the attitude of most reporters? Were they willing to even delve into this subject, or did they just turn a blind eye to it? did most of the reporters out there want nothing to do with it?
Certainly the latter, certainly mainstream reporters. And I went to journalism school at the University of Texas at Austin, graduated with a large number of journalists who reached high-ranking positions in mainstream journalism. They always saw me as sort of an outlier because of my interest in the subject. It was not something that they took seriously. And in fact, that really only began to change in the last decade or so for most of mainstream journalism. And it was also true in connection with the military personnel that I had contact with. Because I lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 years, I got to know, and I lived near the Pentagon. I lived right next to Arlington National Cemetery, and in the condo where I lived, that building was filled with military personnel, CIA, Air Force, etc. And so I had a lot of contact with these people, and their public face, knowing that I was a journalist, their public face to me was to be as incredulous as the journalist I knew. But years later, I learned that behind the scenes, there was a totally different reality going on. I became friends with some former CIA officers who had been high ranking at the level of the staff to the director of the CIA, who told me many stories about how the subject was taken much more seriously than anyone ever publicly let on in that period, 50s, 60s, 70s, right into the 80s. And we know that that's true now because so many books have been published by credible authors and using credible sources that show the pattern of deception that was ongoing. And then finally, it was in the mid 90s that the CIA itself, in one of its own internal publications, which was leaked, admitted that there was an ongoing deception that was orchestrated by the CIA going back to the early 50s, in which CIA officers masqueraded as Air Force officers and interviewed witnesses to various UFO sightings, and tried to convince them that what they had seen was not what they were willing to testify that they saw. And according to this article in the CIA publication, which I described in Alien in the Mirror, the reason behind this was that there were so many different secret spy planes that were in the air during that period, flying out of what we now know to be Area 51, the SR-71 Blackbird, for example, and others, that the excuse being used to deceive the public and to, in fact, confuse UFO witnesses all had to do with an attempt to keep a national security secret.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to. I also want to talk about Project Blue Book, because you mentioned Project Blue Book. I think it started in '52, ended in '69. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was, one of the key investigators involved with Project Blue Book for a number of years. What have you kind of gleaned on your research from their cases? And do you think that they were actively trying to dismiss a lot of these cases?
Oh, yes. Well, certainly they were trying to dismiss. I'm going to check the index here. I've got 10 pages of index material here, and some of it has to do with Project Blue Book. There were a few individuals associated with Blue Book, certainly Hynek toward the end of his association with that organization, who, in my eyes, have credibility. Hynek, as you probably well know, went through a transformation. He was very skeptical of UFOs when he first got involved in the late 50s with Project Blue Book. right on through the early 60s, when the famous case of the sorority girls that saw the UFO, and Hynek tried to dismiss it as swamp gas. And he was so belittled as a result of his dismissal of this UFO sighting as swamp gas that he did almost a 180-degree turnaround in his attitude. So he began to take the subject somewhat more seriously. And he investigated some cases that are documented in the book by other authors. For instance, there's the 1964 case of Socorro, New Mexico, a police officer, Lonnie Zamora, who saw a UFO land along with a couple of entities outside of the vehicle. And that case, ironically, for me personally, was the very first NICAP investigator newsletter that I received in 1964. The cover story was about that particular Lonnie Zamora case. And I remember the photographs being taken, and some of those photographs were taken not just by NICAP investigators, but by Professor Hynek. And it showed the pod marks, the indentation in the ground of those three landing pods. And there was the burnt area when the vehicle took off that was photographed. And Hynek was in his transition period in 1964, seeing that there were cases that couldn't be explained, and the attempts by Project Blue Book and the Air Force to explain most of these cases were simply fraudulent. And he confessed that in many of his books, that it was an attempt to not just confuse the public, it was an attempt to quell any perceived hysteria that the Air Force saw developing, because the fear always had been that the Russians would take advantage of the UFO phenomenon to spread hysteria, i.e., 1939 War of the Worlds, Orson Welles. And this hysteria in turn would mask a sneak attack, or would in some way advance the communist cause of confusing the American people and deception and so forth. So it was a bit of a quagmire because we had Cold War aspects of the entire UFO phenomenon, which have only really been acknowledged over the last 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, and I want to jump forward a bit. And sometimes in other interviews I've done, I don't really get into this till towards the end, but we're kind of in an interesting time where we've had the Navy tracking unknown objects. We've had the New York Times press release. We've had To the Stars Academy. We've had government officials even make statements that we don't know what these things were. Louis Elizondo even came out in a recent interview and said, for those of you that are waiting for disclosure to happen, it's already happened. What's kind of your take on that? Do you agree that disclosure has already happened?
To some extent, I do agree, but I look at this several different ways. What is disclosure? Is disclosure the government, all aspects, all layers of government and the bureaucracy revealing in some sort of orchestrated way exactly what is known? I don't see that for a lot of reasons. For one, the government is so compartmentalized, and the military is so compartmentalized. You've had naval intelligence, for instance, taking the UFO phenomenon much more seriously from the 1950s on than the US Air Force did. What's up with that? Why did the US Navy had seemingly a more open, collected mind about what was going on than did the Air Force? Or did the Air Force have something in its possession that needed to be hidden, or based on national security considerations? there was the perception that it needed to be hidden. There's a question there that's never been fully answered. And then getting back to the nature of disclosure, I wonder if part of the disclosure that's been made that may be referenced is the involvement of different aerospace companies, different private entities as subcontractors of the military in this particular realm. For instance, when it comes to debris from UFO crashes or molten metal that seems to have been spun off from some UFOs during sightings, and that was collected, and metallurgical examinations have been done of this metal. And yet most of it seems to be in private hands. And it's not just the Bigelow Foundation in connection with what they did at Skinwalker Ranch under contract with the US government, but rather other entities, aerospace related, that have had subcontracting roles, some of which to this day are still unknown. So has there been full disclosure in that regard? I don't think so. The veil has been lifted partially. We're starting to get a peek at the various private entities that have been in league with the government in various ways to investigate this phenomenon. But so much remains to be seen, and I'm always an optimist. So I remain optimistic that we will continue to learn more.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the Air Force, because even today, you've got the Navy videos out there, and where has the Air Force been? You haven't really heard a thing from the Air Force officially.
Mhm.
Obviously there's been a lot of whistleblowers that have come forward. You have people who have witnessed these things at missile sites, and Terry Lovelace is one that's a former Air Force guy I've had on the show. Robert Salas, who have talked about was a missile officer at Malmstrom when these things came over, and obviously Robert Hastings written a lot about their interest in nuclear sites and our nuclear technology. What's kind of been? Have you delved into that and their interest in our nuclear ambitions? Have you kind of delved into and researched that side of it?
No, I haven't personally. Obviously, I've read the Hastings book and Stephen Greer's organized efforts and his books in connection with disclosure in nuclear sites and so forth, and the Rendlesham Air Force Base case from 1980 and so forth. And all of that is in Alien in the Mirror. I summarize all of those different cases and the pattern and chronology of all of the cases. But I must say that I've never personally gotten involved. If I were a younger journalist, and if I had the time, the resources, it certainly is a subject that, much like Leslie Kean has done as a journalist, that I would be paying more attention to.
Yeah, I wanted to, so getting back to kind of the Roswell timeframe, in and after that incident, if you will, there's a couple of interesting, things that happened. You had a couple of astronauts who actually have made statements. One of them you mentioned in the book, but I wanted to talk about, this was a Merv Griffin interview. I believe it was in the late 70s. Merv Griffin, who was set down with Gordo Cooper, early Mercury astronaut Gordo Cooper, was talking about the Roswell case. And what can you recount kind of what Gordo Cooper said when he was asked or questioned about the Roswell and kind of what happened there?
Yes. Well, Merv Griffin, as talk show hosts go, had a long time interest in the UFO subject. And he had heard rumors in Hollywood, as a lot of celebrities had, about crashed UFOs, and even Roswell had come up. And so he was curious in having Gordon Cooper on his show to question him about it. And it was an opportunity that he didn't miss. And he asked Gordon, who I only met once. Gordon was quite a character, interesting guy. Merv Griffin asked him, I've heard that there were crashed saucers and there were bodies. And Cooper said something to the effect of, I don't have the transcript in front of me, but his response was that yes, that he had heard as well that there were bodies. And I heard that many times. I heard it from Edgar Mitchell. Edgar Mitchell, one of the moonwalkers. Would you like to hear my Edgar Mitchell story?
Yes, absolutely. I really am quite intrigued by Edgar Mitchell's involvement in this subject as well.
It goes back quite some time to 1975. Edgar Mitchell had been out of the astronaut corps at that point for about a year, and he was in Florida, and he was looking around for a job. And he got a job offer from the National Enquirer tabloid from its publisher, Generoso Pope Jr., who offered him a job to be the science editor of the National Enquirer. And it just so happened that I had received a grant from the Fund for Investigative Journalism to investigate the CIA and mafia connections of the National Enquirer and its publisher, Generoso Pope Jr. So I went undercover as a reporter for the Enquirer and arrived there in the summer of 1975. And I was assigned a desk next to Edgar Mitchell. And I could not let on to Edgar what I was really doing there, as you know, I had to keep it quiet from everyone because I had committed to spending 6 months undercover as a reporter to see how the Enquirer covered various stories, including the UFO subject. Because one of my first assignments from the Enquirer and from Edgar Mitchell as the science editor was to go to a UFO convention in Fort Smith, Arkansas in late summer of 75. So the publisher of the Enquirer, Generoso Pope Jr., had disdain for the UFO subject. He didn't believe in alien visitation or that UFOs were anything other than a figment of imagination. But he was willing to make money from anything that would generate income from the tabloid. And the UFO subject was a big seller for the tabloid. And so I was sent to Fort Smith, and that's where I met J. Allen Hynek for the first time. Of course, had long since retired from Project Blue Book. I also met some of the skeptics of UFOs, like Philip Klass, one of the editors of Aviation Week and Technology Review magazine. And these two individuals, Hynek and Klass, I stayed connected with for years afterward. But long story short, so I went back to Lantana, Florida, a suburb of Palm Beach, where the Enquirer offices were, and had this conversation with Edgar Mitchell. And I said, I didn't really find anything newsworthy at this convention. And he said, but your job was to go and find something worthwhile that we could print in the tabloid. So you need to come up with something. So I had to confess that I was about to resign, that I was there under false pretenses and so forth. So I stayed in the Florida area around the Enquirer for about a year after that, doing interviews with Enquirer editors, their reporters, off the record for the most part. And by that point, Edgar Mitchell had resigned from the Enquirer as science editor. And so he agreed to be interviewed by me for the book that I was writing about the mafia and CIA connections of the Enquirer. And I remember asking Edgar why did you agree to do a job with the National Enquirer? I mean, what was the reaction of your fellow astronauts and so forth? And he sort of chuckled, and then he said, well, I always had an interest in the UFO subject. I always felt that there was something more to it, even while I was an astronaut. And I had this opportunity to look at the subject more deeply, using the Enquirer's resources and their reporters who he would send out to investigate stories like Travis Walton. The Travis Walton story occurred around the time that I resigned from the Enquirer. And the reporter that looked at that story was Bob Pratt, who ended up writing a series of books about UFOs, such as UFO sightings in Brazil, for instance. So I interviewed Edgar Mitchell, and he admitted that he had felt shamed working for the Enquirer, and that he had lost some face among his astronaut buddies and so forth, because they all considered it to be a trash tabloid. But it really did set Edgar off on a trajectory that ended up with him founding the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is now based out of Petaluma, California, not far from where I'm speaking to you right now. So it's interesting to me, as I look back over the decades of being involved at the periphery of this phenomenon, how people's lives can, and the trajectory of their lives, be changed very quickly as a result of even innocently getting involved with this subject.
Edgar Mitchell had publicly stated that he had insiders within the government that told him the Roswell crash happened and that bodies were recovered. Is that correct?
Yes. He never had, or certainly never related to anyone I know or to me, any of the details of that. This was mostly people that he held in high regard, who had high roles within the military industrial establishment, who made these claims and told him the stories. And he felt intuitively that they were telling the truth.
Interesting. Yeah, you've got another interesting thread in the book about Edgar Mitchell and how he kind of facilitated a meeting. Now, there's a lot of buzz about this infamous Admiral Wilson memo,
Mm-hmm.
And that he facilitated a meeting between Dr. Stephen Greer and Admiral Wilson. And can you kind of talk a little bit about what came out of that, or what reportedly came out of that meeting, and what kind of the fallout was from that?
Well, Admiral Wilson became head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the meeting was allegedly held in his office in the Pentagon. And it involved 3 or 4 people. It wasn't just Edgar Mitchell and Dr. Greer, but a couple of other individuals as well, who are named in other books that I summarize. I never personally investigated this other than having talked with some of the participants. And Wilson, again, it gets back to what I was talking about concerning Arthur Lundahl with the CIA, saying one thing publicly and another thing privately. Apparently, Wilson publicly would always deny that he said what he said, but then privately he made some confessions about UFO artifacts having from Roswell been retained by the military and undergone analysis at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and elsewhere. So I never know in situations like this where you have participants come out of a meeting, and several of them spoke publicly, although much of what happened or what we now know about Admiral Wilson in that meeting only came about after Edgar Mitchell's death. After he died, his personal papers were sorted through by several UFO investigators, and information and some memos concerning this meeting with Admiral Wilson were discovered. And that's sort of how all of this quickly evolved into the mid 2000s. And I've never really been able to make a decision for myself because I always try to weigh evidence, pro and con, and I try not to have a belief system in place that's going to taint my perception of the evidence. I've never been able to make a firm determination for myself whether or not Admiral Wilson was telling a huge public lie, or whether or not the individuals who met with him, Edgar Mitchell, Dr. Greer, and the others, whether or not they misperceived what they thought he said. It remains a mystery in my book.
And I think I've heard you say something to the effect in the book that you've been impartial on the subject, just kind of reporting and gathering and researching the information. Do you still take that stance on the subject?
Yes. Well, I started Second Look magazine to create a middle ground between believers and skeptics and debunkers, because I always had some problems as a journalist with both sides. I always felt that there was more than one side, that by trying to navigate the middle ground between both sides, that I might come closer to the truth than if I were to veer off on the one side or the other. The problem that I always had with skeptics and debunkers is that debunkers thought that they were skeptics. They thought that they had open minds. They thought that they were asking the right questions. But in actuality, what I discovered is that most debunkers, unfortunately, were mean-spirited. They had a sniveling disbelief in virtue, which is a dictionary definition of cynicism rather than skepticism. And so, because debunkers were quite often cynics, they were always questioning the motives of witnesses. And sometimes I found that, yes, the motives should be questioned. Sometimes there were charlatans, there were people that were hoaxsters and pranksters and so forth in this field. That's always true. But you can't start from the premise that alien visitation is impossible. When you start from that premise, then as a cynic, you're always going to try to find and question the motives of anyone who experiences something out of the ordinary. And then on the other hand, with many UFO believers, I found that there was this desire to prove a point of view by shoehorning into a box all of the evidence, and what doesn't fit, they would cast away as being irrelevant. And that always was an approach that never really appealed to me as a journalist. So, as a result, just like I'm an independent voter, I have never been a Republican or a Democrat. There's something in my nature to where I'm always trying to find a consensus by weighing all the different points of view, and especially the opposing points of view. And as a result of, I like to say, I am open-minded, but not so open-minded that my brains fall out. And I'm not rigid enough to where I feel the need to prove every one of the prejudices that I might otherwise unconsciously have.
There has been a lot of people who have, well, I don't know if I should say a lot of people. I've heard statements out there. People said Philip Klass was on the payroll of the CIA. Some of these debunkers, they, as you said before, they were really quick to dismiss anything. And, always in the back of my mind, I'm always wondering, it goes back to, is there an active disinformation campaign? And have some of these people been on the payrolls of the government, of the CIA, to actively spread disinformation and try and discredit witnesses and whistleblowers and stuff like that? So, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that perspective as always kind of trying to be impartial and gather the evidence and kind of let the evidence take you where it will. But I've always in the back of my mind with some of these debunkers and skeptics have always wondered.
Hmm. Well, the big three always were Philip Klass, James Oberg, and Robert Schaefer. And I knew all three of them because of Second Look magazine and the contact that I had with them. Klass in particular, again, supported my point of view that they truly felt like they were on a righteous mission. They felt like they were the spear points of rationality, and that by using rationality, again, coming from the premise that alien visitation was not just improbable, but probably impossible, that they would debunk and do a public service. So I don't know that any of the three of them necessarily had to be on the payroll of any disinformation campaign by a government agency. They were willful in what they did. And even if they consciously knew that they were perpetuating a disinformation campaign, and they did it consciously, then they thought that they were doing so for the higher good. So it's conceivable that they were manipulated. Yes, I would feel that the nature of the disinformation campaigns that have been made public over the last 10 years or so would certainly point us in that direction.
Now, Randall, physicist Neil deGrasse Tyson has made some statements about the Navy videos, and I'm wondering if you've kind of heard of some of his statements, and if you have, what do you think he kind of fits into that same kind of class?
I don't know if he's mean-spirited. I can't assess him psychologically as I could the other debunkers that I knew personally. But from what I've read of him, he certainly comes from a rigid perspective, much as his predecessors in the debunking world did. The rigidity is based on him making a decision that the evidence he has seen or refuses to see as a result of being unwilling to really dive deeply into the subject area, saying that it's a waste of his time. What he refuses to analyze is what would shatter his worldview. A lot of these people who think of themselves as championing science and rationality, much like the people that persecuted Galileo, they're willing to persecute ideas, maybe less so people. And the Philip Klasses were willing to persecute people and smudge and demean their character in public. I don't know that Neil is one of those types of debunkers, but the impact that he has can be just as toxic.
I know we're kind of getting a little bit short on time, and I know you have done some research on a pretty famous, multiple witness case, if you will, in the Phoenix Lights incident of 1997. You've delved into some research, you've talked to witnesses. And you've got an interesting twist on this that I haven't heard before. And can you kind of talk a little bit about your research and that direction you were going with this particular case?
Certainly. Well, as many people were after May 13th, 1997, when the five lights were seen across all of Arizona, not just Phoenix, but from northern Arizona all the way to southern Arizona during the course of that night. I was fascinated by that. I was curious about it. And I happened to be in a position at that time as the roving editor of Reader's Digest magazine to have the resources at my disposal to investigate this particular case in some depth. So I spent a couple of months doing a lot of interviews after that April 13th sighting, and ended up interviewing more than 50 people. And there were three categories of witnesses that I wanted. First category was people on the ground who had looked at the lights through binoculars. The second category was the pilots that were in the air that night that might have seen the light formation or have had some contact with the formation. And the third category were the air traffic controllers, both at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, but also the regional air traffic controllers who should have been in a position to know what was in the air that night. So I focused on those three types of witnesses, as well as other witnesses on the ground, especially in the Phoenix area. And as people may recall, there was a pattern in the witness reports. In the northern Arizona area after 8 p.m. of that night, as people looked up at the Hale-Bopp comet in the northern sky, they saw the formation of five lights. And many of those people in northern Arizona looked at the lights through binoculars. I interviewed quite a few of them. And what they reported was they saw five independent lights, unattached, that occasionally, and there was even a video that was made of the light formation that showed one of the five lights that would follow behind less closely at times the other lights, and then would speed up and catch up to the rest of the formation. So these seem to be independent lights. And according to the people looking through binoculars, it looked as if these were planes that had the landing lights in their noses of the craft pointing down toward the ground for some reason. As the formation got closer to the Phoenix suburbs, people on the ground began reporting that what they saw was one large craft. And these were five lights on one huge craft. And there were dozens of witness reports to that end as well. And then when the lights passed over Phoenix and started heading toward Tucson, again, following the interstate highway system, which I always thought was interesting. Why would alien visitors feel the need or desire to fly along the interstate highway system along the entire pathway of the state of Arizona? People south of Phoenix toward Tucson were reporting again, as the people in northern Arizona did, that these were five independent lights. So then I found pilots that were in the sky that night. I interviewed a number of different crews of pilots, and I recount these interviews in the book. And what the pilots reported is that they saw five independent lights on aircraft. And again, it seemed to be lights in the noses of these planes that were pointed down toward the ground, which was a violation of FAA flight rules in a number of different respects. Number one, flying in formation at night with your landing lights on. And then when I talked to air traffic controllers, as I did from Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, as well as the regional air system in Denver. There was a lot of confusion. They really claimed that they didn't see anything on radar at night that would conform to what was seen by way of five lights or a huge object with five lights on it. So as I investigated further, I wanted to know where the lights ended up later that night after they passed Phoenix and went to Tucson. And there were reports that the lights continued on past Tucson and then disappeared on the horizon. So I began investigating what is to the south near the Mexican border of Tucson. And there is an airstrip there, and there is a military base there, and it's Fort Wahushka. Wahushka, I think is the name. So in investigating what goes on there, for years it's been, and it was at that time when the sighting occurred in 1997, it was where psychological warfare training took place. It's where all of the armed services sent their specialists to undergo psychological warfare training. So, and I began looking again at the origin of the lights. Where did they come from? Well, they actually came from Nevada, and they came from the direction of Area 51. So if we were to draw a link on the map and just speculate, why would these lights, if indeed they were one object or five separate objects, why would they go from the Area 51 region down to south of Tucson to a airstrip that was at a military base that was devoted to psychological warfare? What was going on? Why were so many people out that night, on a clear night for the most part, watching the Hale-Bopp comet? And these lights obviously wanted to be seen, crisscrossing the entire state. They wanted to be seen, and they were. But the reports, again, were contradictory. Whatever you choose to believe, five independent lights or one giant object with five lights on them. So I tried to examine then what could account for that disparity. And the only thing I could come up with was a psychological warfare diversion of a sort that involved holographic warfare testing. Holographs had been speculated to be a part of the psychological warfare arsenal of the US military all through the 1990s. Now, holographic technology wasn't supposedly developed and perfected during that period of time. But as we all know, what goes on in black budgets usually involves technology that's a decade or so ahead of what we know publicly. So I raised the question in the article I did for Reader's Digest about the Arizona lights, and then that I expanded in this book, Alien in the Winter Mirror. I raised the question of whether or not this was a psychological warfare experiment involving holographic technology.
That's an interesting twist and one I hadn't heard before. And thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's there's been other theories, and some of them don't seem very credible. That people were seeing flares out on the Barry Goldwater Range.
Yeah, that was a second incident. There were flares on the Barry Goldwater Range. I was able to, as many other journalists did, document that. But it was two separate incidents that occurred. The earlier sighting that was statewide was sometime an hour or so before the flares were dropped on the Goldwater Range. And those two incidents were quite often mistaken, and there was a lot of confusion surrounding that.
Sure. As I said, we're running short on time here, Randall. So the book again is Alien in the Mirror, Extraterrestrial Contact Theories and Evidence. Now, obviously the book's on Amazon. Where else can you share a website, or where else people can find the book?
Yes, my website is alieninthemirror.com.
There you go. All right. Well, Randall, I really appreciate you joining me tonight. And
well, thank you for the provocative questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I much appreciate it.
It's been a great discussion, and I really enjoyed it. And hopefully down the road again, you can join me again. There's so many things that I'd love to talk about. We're just unfortunately short on time tonight.
I would love to.
All right. Thanks again, Randall. Have a great rest of your night. And once again, thank you for
thank you.
Talking
Happy trails.